Hello and welcome back. Uh, we are starting chapter 22 today, and we're going to start talking about the Great Depression. So now that we're rounding out the Roaring Twenties, we're going to look into the effects or the side effects of the Decade of Indulgences. So for the first section, we're going to talk about the nation's sick economy, and we're going to focus on a couple of things. What were the underlying causes of the Great Depression? Because there were many. How did specifically Black Tuesday cause a chain reaction? And three, how did the Depression affect U.S. involvement in world politics? So now, in order to understand the Depression, I want to summarize and review the Roaring Twenties again. Remember, the 20s was what I like to think of it as the decade of indulgences. You see here in this picture, people are buying cars, but what type of cars? Not just Ford Model T, they're buying luxurious cars. They're having more money to spend. So they're going on fashion trips in Paris and buying the latest fashions, or they're buying the latest fashions from their local boutiques. You have the Prohibition Amendment, which is the 18th Amendment, and people are spending more and more money on illegal alcohol, which is giving more money in the hands of organized crime. Then you have things like starting of national pastimes, the NFL and football. People are paying money to go see sporting events. You have tourism that's on the rise with the invention of the airplane. It's really taking off commercially. And then you have things like jazz, the Harlem Renaissance, movies, all of these things that we take for granted now and do in our spare time. These are all the things that people are spending money on in the 20s. So now, in order to understand the Great Depression, it's important that you understand the causes, because similar to World War I, there wasn't a single cause for why the United States entered the war, nor was there a single cause for the Great Depression. But in order to understand the entire event, you have to understand the causes. So the first underlying cause is this idea of declining businesses. After World War I, America no longer had the need for excess amounts of goods. And so as soldiers returned home, businesses started to decline. You see a decline in utilities, in the rail industry, in the textile industry, in the steel industry especially, because we're not making warships or planes like we were during the war. So all of these people that are employed are getting let go, and then there's an even bigger number getting let go after soldiers are returning home especially. So slowly you're having a decline in the market. The next underlying cause is farmers, who at this time are also declining as well as an industry. After the war, there's a universal lowering in demand for goods like wheat or barley or general crops, because we don't need them to export to other countries. Europe's, regaining their strength. They're starting to farm again. Nor are we feeding our soldiers overseas. So there's a general demand. There's also a decrease in price because there's not a big demand. The price is going down. And so what Congress tries to do is enact price supports, which would help farmers. But instead, that gets vetoed altogether. And so farmers get no assistance from the government. Next is credit. People are buying on credit like we do today. The idea that they will go to the store and buy things with credit. They'd put a little bit of money down maybe, and then they would buy it under the assumption they'll pay it off later. Well, this helps, expand business at first because people can buy bigger items that they wouldn't have had the money all at one time. People are using credit so frequently, they're going to get themselves in trouble. Just like today, when people rack up too much credit card debt, it's the same idea. Credit is a good thing when you can use it, but when you have too much, it hurts people. Next, consumers in general in America have less money to spend. This means that, because there's a decline in business, there's less money that people are making, which means they're spending less. So slowly there's a general, downward trend of the business, the economic cycle, which is expected after a war. Next comes unequal distribution of wealth. During the 1920s, with business in the decade of luxury, The rich got richer and the poor got poorer. The wealthiest percent owned close to 75% of the wealth in America, the top percent, where the bottom 70% of people only made less than $2,500 a year, which was the basic minimum to get by. That would be like their threshold of poverty that we have in the United States. So it's a very unequal distribution of wealth. You have very, very poor people and very, very rich people. Finally, you have the idea and sentiment of pro-business. This started with Coolidge especially, the idea that businesses should have little governmental regulation. As a result, they started to take advantage of the market, and the government didn't step in to advise people one way or another. Next comes Mr. Hoover. Hoover, remember, was the Secretary of Commerce under both Harding and Coolidge, so he has a background in economics. And he supports big business. Remember, this is one of the underlying causes of the Depression, the fact that big business ran the economy. Hoover, in the 1928 election, ran on the platform of experience, meaning experience with the government as the Secretary of Commerce. He never held a publicly elected office before, but he was the Secretary of Commerce for a long time, and he used this to talk about his experience, meaning, hey, if you like what's going on in the economy right now, and this is in 1928, the mid of the roaring 20s, and people did like what was going on, he said, vote for me. We're going to continue having the same thing. And so he wins with an overwhelming majority. And this shows that the people are happy with the Republican Party. They like what's going on. They like all the new inventions that are coming and social freedoms that they're getting. And as a result, he makes a statement, we in America are nearer to the final triumph over poverty than ever before. And it's very ironic that he says it when he takes office, considering that he's talking about eliminating poverty altogether, and then within 1 year of him being in office, we have the Great Depression. So the year is 1929, and remember, Hoover is in office as the president, and some economists are starting to warn the country that the economy is in a fragile state. But because everyone was making money, they were enjoying the 20s, most Americans didn't listen to them. And so you see the biggest difference in the stock market here. Now, the stock market is where companies sell stocks, which is a piece of their company, and you can buy it for a certain amount of money, and then you own part of that company. And so those who had extra money, invested in stock. For a long time, and still to this day, it's a great way to invest your money. And in 1929, the Dow Jones Industrial Average was used to measure the strength of the stock market. And we still do to this day use the Dow Jones. And what it does is it looks at the top 30 stocks on the New York Stock Exchange to measure the size of the stock market. And in this period, it was measuring it very high. Stocks were growing at an exponential rate, and so it looked like the stock market was doing great. And so by 1929, about 4 million Americans own stock, which is only about 3% of the population. But it's the upper top 3% of the country, mainly. And they put their money in stocks as a way to invest. The problem becomes, then, greed. People soon to buy stocks on speculation, which means that they were buying risky stocks to make a quick buck. So instead of buying stocks in reputable companies where you would make maybe a little bit of money, they were buying stocks in really, really new companies, in risky companies, because that's where you can make a lot of money if you invest well. But if you do this too much, you can also lose everything. Then, in order to make more money, people began to buy on margin, which is just like credit, if you want to think of it like that. The fact that they would put a little bit of money down when they bought the stock, and then they would just borrow the rest from someone else or the bank. So they didn't have all this money that they were buying stocks with. And because the government was, encouraged big business, they did little to discourage this type of greed activity here. They didn't say it one way or another. So this only continued. So then, with all the causes of, greed, speculation, buying on credit, something was bound to happen. And those economists that had warned the country were right. In September of 1929, this stocks peak and then soon began to fall. And so as what happens, some investors begin to unload their stocks. So over time you see stocks are getting more expensive, and then right here in September 1929, they peak and they start to fall. That's normal, but some investors began to unload their stocks, meaning they would sell it for what it was worth at that point. Then it continues to get worse, as we see here. You have, on October 28th, 1929, the market took another plunge and investors began to sell even more of their stocks. So then, October 29th comes and it keeps going down. And people, as the price of the stock is going down, are selling more and more and more of their stock. But this is where they start to lose their money. So if they bought their stock, at this part right here for $100, let's say, maybe they can only sell it for $50 right now. So they do to make some money back, but they're already losing $50 a share. So it means for every stock, they're going to start to lose money on. Then, this gets even worse. In October 1929, or Black Tuesday. It is the worst day, still to this day, in U.S. stock market history. The market comes and all the way hits rock bottom. It hits the ground floor. Shareholders tried to sell their stocks as best as they could, and they sold them for the bare minimum if they could. So if they bought a stock up here for, let's say, $100 again, and then all of a sudden they have to wait down here, maybe they sell it for $1. So they lost $99, for example. Or maybe they couldn't sell it at all, and so they own a part of this company, but there's no way it'll ever be worth that money again. So they lose all this money because soon people aren't buying stocks anymore. It's not worth it. Then by mid-November, Americans lost $30 billion because of this, which is close to, in today's money, close to $410 billion. That's how much money was lost from September to November of 1929. So the idea is Black Tuesday. This is what it's known as. It's when the market hit rock bottom and the most amount of shares, 16.4 million shares, were sold or dumped. This is the highest amount of shares that were ever traded, sold on one day in American history. So it's important to know that the Black Tuesday doesn't cause the Great Depression. There are four main causes, though, and most historians disagree about the exact causes, but these are the four causes that most historians agree on. First, that tariffs and war debt policies cut down the foreign market for goods. So in Europe, people were paying so much in taxes to repay reparations or to pay back their government that they couldn't buy American goods. So America was selling less goods overseas. Then you have the crisis of the farm sector where farmers had less money to buy goods. They were in increasing amount of debt, and then they couldn't pay that back as a result. Then you had the availability of easy credit, meaning people could buy whatever they wanted and find really easy credit, just like today. It was before the Great Recession of 2009. It was so easy to get your hands on a credit card and rake up tons of debt. And then the final of the big four causes is that there was a huge unequal distribution of wealth. So the top 1%, remember, owned 70% of the wealth. And when they lost their wealth, who lost their jobs? All the poor people who worked in these people's company. Who was most affected? The poor. Because remember, if the wealthy, were worth $10 million and lost $5 million, they were still wealthy. They still had $5 million. But then they started to make cuts in their lives. Maybe they laid off a ton of extra servants they had, or they stopped buying lots of cars, or they closed parts of their company. All of those changes would have affected the poorest people. And so it's important to know that Black Tuesday did not cause the Great Depression. I'll say it again. Black Tuesday did not cause the Great Depression. In fact, it was just the tipping point. But the Great Depression was so great because of all of these failures that happened and all of the causes that led up to this. Some of the failures, maybe the most important, was the bank failures. When people began to lose their money in the stock market, they ran to get their money out of banks. And you can see here, there's a line around the block of people trying to take all of their money out of the bank. But the banks invested people's money in the stock market too. This is a huge idea here because the bank didn't have all of the money on hand. And so when the bank had no money, they closed their doors. And in 1929, the year of the crash, 600 banks closed. And 4 years later, almost one half of the nation's banks closed. Now remember, at this time, if you put your money in the bank, it wasn't insured. Today, if you put your money in the bank and the bank closes, the government will give you your money back, up to $250,000. So you don't have to worry about putting your money in Chase Bank, for example. Back then, they didn't have this. As the banks closed, all people's savings were just lost. There's no way you could get your money back. So let's say you were saving up for a new house and you had $10,000 in there, which would be a lot by that in 1920 standards. And the bank closed, you lost all that money and you were on your own. So then this affects people who didn't make risky stock, buying and selling of risky stocks, because maybe it was regular middle-day Americans who lost all their money in the banks, so it had nothing to do with them, but they started to get affected. Then you also have a series of business failures. First, American GDP starts to decline from 104 to 59 billion, meaning we are exporting less around the world, so we're not making as much money. During this time, 90,000 businesses went bankrupt and then laid off all these people. And remember, when a business went bankrupt back then, there was no bankruptcy insurance either. So there was no way you could get your money back if you went bankrupt. And finally, unemployment skyrocketed from 3% in 1929 to 25% in 1933. Just to put that in perspective, these past couple years during the Great Recession, when people were talking about how high unemployment is, we never passed 10% of unemployment in America in 2009 and 10 when unemployment was the highest. Back in 1933, unemployment was 25%. So almost double what it was, more than double I should say, what it was just a few years ago. So how does this affect the world? Well, after the Great War, World War I, Europe was struggling already because Germany had to pay back all their reparations and France and Britain owed the U.S. huge sums of money. So this is why the citizens of these countries weren't buying American goods, because they were paying a large amount of taxes, and so they didn't have any money to spare to really buy American goods. Then U.S. Import of European goods started to decline as well. As Americans had no money, they weren't going to spend the money on European goods. So it's an overall decline of goods being traded. Then this only gets worse with the Hawley-Smoot Tariff in 1930, which established the highest protective tariff in U.S. history. The goal was that it was going to add an extra tax onto foreign goods to buy American. So if you have the choice of buying, let's say, at this time, a car, either from Ford or from Mercedes, and Mercedes come from Germany, there's going to be a tariff on the Mercedes car, making it so expensive you would buy the Ford car. Good idea in theory, right? Except it led to a series of problems. One, that other countries responded by placing huge tariffs on U.S. goods. So now Germans, who may have had money, aren't going to buy the Ford products either. As a result of both of these types of tariffs, global trade declined by 40%. This is huge because you make a lot of money when you export things. And so if it's declined by 40%, overall, our GDP is going down. The GDP, the money in France and Britain are going down. which then they can't continue to pay back us for the loans. Germany can't continue to pay back France and Britain. So it's only causing more and more economic problems. And it actually made American unemployment worse. The congressmen thought they were doing this huge thing of helping everyone. They made problems way worse with the Hawley-Smoot tariff. And it's believed that if it wasn't for this tariff, the Great Depression could have ended years earlier. So, I know we talked about a lot, but it's important that you understand at least the four main underlying causes of the Great Depression. One is that, farmers were in a lot of debt. Two was that there was tons of credit available and people were using it too frequently. Then you have an unequal distribution of wealth that resides in the hands of the wealthy and not the poor. And then you also have so many tariffs, especially the Hawley-Smoot tariff, that really kills industry between America and the rest of the world. Then you also need to know that Black Tuesday did not cause the Great Depression, but it led to a domino or a chain reaction of events that made the Depression so impactful for the rest of America and the world, really. And then finally, how did the Depression affect involvement with world politics? Well, we really stopped doing a majority of our trading, so trade declines. Then you have the Hawley-Smoot tariff, which hurt relations with the rest of the world and continued to further decline trade. In the next video, we'll talk about some of the impacts of all this. So right now, it's just important that you understand really the causes of the Great Depression. So that's it. Until next time, Husky historians.